The enemy still holds their position in Chattanooga, and our lines drawn up close around the place. We are now on the top of Lookout Mountain, overlooking the town. We have a fine view of our entire line and also of theirs. It is said that we can see into 5 different states from our position. It is very cold up here, as cold as it is where you are in midwinter. You must excuse this exceedingly bad letter, as I have written in great haste. My love to you and all. Write when you can, and a long letter, as I am very anxious to hear from you. John Sweet, 9th Tennessee Infantry.
Lookout Mountain here in Chattanooga, Tennessee offers some of the most scenic views that any battlefield has to offer. And after the fight here, it would be dubbed the Battle Above the Clouds. Now, today we are here at Lookout Mountain and we're going to explore where this battle was actually fought. This episode is sponsored by History Fix. History Fix is a history-centered streaming service that helps you escape back into history through movies, documentaries, docudramas, and even how-tos. All the content on this platform is created by history buffs for history buffs. Do you enjoy learning about the American Civil War? If so, check out my exclusive series called Battlefield Chronicles, airing only on History Fix. In this first episode, join me on our search for Captain Henry Fuller on the Gettysburg battlefield. To find out more, click the link down below in the description. Now, initially, the daunting nature of the terrain on Lookout Mountain discouraged Grant from making an attack against it. However, on the morning of November 24th of 1863, Grant authorized General Joseph Hooker and his corps to make a demonstration against the Confederate left and to push on to Point Lookout if it became practicable. Rather than attack the mountain head-on, Hooker planned to move his troops across Lookout Creek below the Confederate position and advance along the base of the mountain, unknowingly towards the point of a weakened spot on the Confederate line due to a withdrawal of a considerable force. Now, in order to see where the fight for Lookout Mountain actually happened, we got to take a trail to the original Confederate position of the 24th and 27th Mississippi, which is about a half mile from the Cravens property behind us. So as you can see, it's already looking a little different when you think of the Battle Above the Clouds. And here we are, taking a trail with no scenic views in sight yet. Now, as we make our way to the original positions of the 24th and 27th Mississippi and their rifle pits, I want to take a look at the terrain here. Obviously, we're on a mountain and it's not going to be perfectly flat, but look at this from the lens of a 19th century military doctrine and think about how this terrain wasn't conducive to the linear warfare of the time. And imagine being a soldier on either side, either as a Union assaulting over this very ground, or a Confederate soldier defending and then retreating over this very ground. It's always pretty interesting to come out to the battlefields and see the terrain for what it truly is. It really helps offer a little bit of clarity here. All right, so we're coming to the Confederate works here, just up ahead. So at around 8:30 in the morning on November 24th of 1863, General John Geary's division would begin their assault in this general direction. They would advance across a creek and up to this location with heavy dense fog conveniently screening their movements here. And they would be advancing up this way towards us on the camera here, and also from this direction here. Now I'm going to pan back to my right and you can see the remnants of the Confederate works here. Maybe a little hard to see, but right along here, the positions of the 24th and 27th Mississippi from Brigadier General Edward Walthall's brigade. And I believe the rest of his brigade was posted near the Cravens property about a half mile back from where we started. So these men will be in position here, and you can just imagine men of both armies were out in the elements for months up until this point. If you recall, the Union was defeated at Chickamauga at the end of September, and they pulled back to this location. In pursuit were the Confederates under the command of Braxton Bragg. So the Union sheltered in Chattanooga, and the Confederates took up positions along the mountainous terrain of Chattanooga here. So these men have been out in the elements for months up until this point. It is now the end of November, and now you have an entire division of Union troops advancing towards your advanced line here, and these regiments probably weren't at full strength. Now, I've read that the heavy dense fog screened much of the Union movements here, and by the time the Confederates knew the Union were coming, they were pretty much right on top of these works here. Now, I also read that there was some sporadic fighting up and down these works, and oddly enough, the works were facing the wrong direction. There was an Illinois regiment that had an account that once they made this area, they discovered that the Confederate works were facing in the opposite direction. So they were able to start firing into the flanks of the Confederate defenders. Now, I don't know if that specific account happened here, but it happened somewhere in this area here. So as you can see, the Confederates simply didn't have enough men to defend this location. And if you look at the terrain, again, it kind of seems like a really strong position. Kind of similar to Culp's Hill, if you've ever been there in the winter, and you can really see the terrain for what it is. But panning back to my left here, and I'll just give you another brief layout of the area here. And this is the position where we came from. There's a trail that wraps back around the mountain. And I believe, if I'm oriented correctly, the summit of Lookout Mountain is up there.
To our joy, we saw that their works had been constructed to resist a direct attack from below, and that from our position we could rake them with an enfilading fire. Sergeant Charles Partridge, 96th Illinois Infantry.
If you know me by now, and you've been following the channel, I absolutely love just taking the time at these historic sites and just kind of trying to envision the battle. Right here would have been a defender from the 24th or 27th Mississippi, when all of a sudden, out of the dense fog, you have a wave of Union troops, a whole division, and maybe you get a few shots off, maybe you don't, maybe you're captured, maybe you run back to your fallback location, but just knowing that that action that you read about happened right in here, it's a pretty cool feeling. There's nothing better. And if you don't like history, I don't know how you can't, because this is way better than math.
My men poured into their advancing columns a terrible fire. Soon their lines broke and retreated. I saw one stand of the enemy's colors twice fall. Lieutenant Colonel A.J. Jones, 27th Mississippi Infantry.
Now, despite their best efforts, Brigadier General Edward Walthall knew that his men were not going to be able to hold this position. He knew he needed a fallback position. So he had men forming around what would be the Cravens property in anticipation of the blue Union tidal wave advancing towards them in this general area here. So we're going to head back to the Cravens house and see how this battle unfolds later in the day.
The right of our line extended so far up the mountain that it overlapped the enemy's rifle pits, and before the enemy was aware of it, he was flanked. Captain George Collins, 149th New York Infantry.
So we made our way back to what is now called the Cravens house. Now, during the battle, this area was owned by Robert Cravens, who was a local ironmaster in Chattanooga. And obviously, when the battle came to the doorstep of Chattanooga for a second time, this area was held by Brigadier General Edward Walthall's Mississippi Brigade. So I'm going to pan to my left, and that is the general direction where we were at the Confederate earthworks. And they would pull back towards this general direction and begin reuniting with the rest of their brigade in anticipation with fighting the Union here on the Cravens property. Now, you're probably wondering how an entire Confederate brigade consisting of almost 1,500 men and a Union division fight in this little sliver of land here. Well, it's important to know that the fighting was unfolding all around this general area. So down this way, as you can see, there's some monuments down here. You had Walthall's Mississippi Brigade and, of course, the Union attackers coming in this area as well. They were also coming from this general area, the direction of the Confederate works. And it's important to know that the Union troops were also kind of enveloping this area, and you had fighting on that slope before us here. But in this general area, I want to touch on a figure you may or may not heard of. Colonel David Ireland was commanding a brigade here at Chattanooga. Now, several months before this, at the Battle of Gettysburg, Colonel David Ireland was in command of the 137th New York on Culp's Hill, and you can credit him with saving the Union right flank for what he did at Culp's Hill, refusing his line and holding that flank until essentially he was relieved by reinforcements. But here at Chattanooga, he was in charge of a brigade, and within his brigade, the 60th New York and the 137th New York would capture a Confederate battery in this location. Now, I don't know if the battery in front of us or section in front of us was that battery he captured, but that battery, or section I should say, that he captured unfolded right in this area here. Now, something else that's interesting is Colonel George Cobham's Pennsylvanians were beginning to deliver a flanking fire into Walthall's Mississippians. So Walthall's men were essentially overwhelmed here, and they would pull back beyond the Cravens property here. They would regroup and launch another assault here and essentially meet the same result. You had musket fire from the slopes here, and then of course we still had fighting going on below us here in this general area. Now, Walthall and his brigade weren't the only ones here defending this location. The Confederates did manage to bring up some reinforcements under the command of General John C. Moore, and his brigade would essentially launch an assault in this direction, and they would be enfiladed by the Pennsylvanians up on the ridge here and by the Union muskets in this general area. And this area was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer mass of Union troops, and the Cravens property here was now in Union hands. Now, after the battle, the Union forces here would use the home as a headquarters and also an encampment for reporters. And ironically, it was during this time that the house received the most damage. So it obviously received damage during the battle, but when the reporters were here and this was a Union headquarters, it received quite a bit of damage during that process. Now, after the war ended, the Cravens family would return to Lookout Mountain, and they would rebuild the home, which was completed in 1866. Now, something else to note here, you can see this two-gun section from Howe's Georgia battery, is they weren't really able to fire because Walthall's men were positioned in front of us here, so they were engaged with the enemy. And once they were overwhelmed, you had a mass of Confederates pulling back towards us on the camera, followed by the Union attackers here. So these guns weren't able to fire unless they wanted to rip canister through their own men. But these guns were essentially abandoned, and they had to be left behind, and essentially these guns never fired a shot right here. Now, we mentioned that this area was enveloped in fog, and as the fighting was unfolding, you had Union troops down in the city of Chattanooga just trying to get a view of the battle here, but they couldn't see it. All they could do was hear it, and they didn't really know who was winning or how things were going up here until the next day when the fog cleared and they can see the stars and stripes of the American flag flying over this area, and they let out a pretty loud cheer in downtown Chattanooga there. I thought that was pretty cool. But due to the fog enveloping this area and essentially masking the results of the battle as it was unfolding, this area and battle became known as the Battle Above the Clouds. So we've moved locations. We moved a couple hundred yards south of the Cravens house here, and in this general area is where the shattered brigades of Walthall's men and Brown's men would make a final stand. Now, despite the Union success near the Cravens property, the Confederates were able to hold this position and prevent the capture of the Summertown Road, which is in this general direction here. Now, that road was important because that road led to the top of Lookout Mountain. And if that road was captured, you would essentially have all the Confederates atop Lookout Mountain stranded, and they would be captured in turn. So panning back to my right, the Cravens property is a couple hundred yards down this road, and back to the final stand of the remnants of what was left of the Confederate defense here. Now, before we wrap things up here on Lookout Mountain, there is one more spot that I want to share with you. Now, we can't come to Lookout Mountain and talk about the battle and not come to Point Park for this beautiful view here. This has got to be one of my favorite views of any battlefield that I have personally visited. Wow. Now, for some orientation purposes, we were just at the Cravens property right there. That is where the majority of the battle unfolded. So we have moved our way up to Point Park here, where the Confederates had a few batteries, but no major fighting happened up here. But man, this view, how could you beat it? Now, there may be other battlefields that offer better views, but man, this one is hard to beat. Now, if you remember in an earlier episode, we covered the actions of Brown's Ferry and opening up the Cracker Line. Well, that took place in this general area. Union troops would board their flat-bottom boats, move their way down the Tennessee River under the Confederate muzzles up here on Lookout Mountain, and they would open up the dubbed Cracker Line. So that happened just down there. And here's obviously the town of Chattanooga. And in the distance, you can just make out Missionary Ridge there. All right, so we're approaching a Confederate battery here in Point Park. And this battery is Garrity's Alabama battery, and it consisted of two 10-pound Parrott rifles along with two 12-pound Napoleons. And they were positioned in this general area for about 2 months throughout the siege here. So you can just imagine having a battery atop Lookout Mountain and being exposed to the elements, and you're here for almost 2 months. Now, this battery did see some action. It would engage Union forces who were moving wagons near Moccasin Point, where Brown's Ferry was that we visited earlier. And once the Union forces took Orchard Knob, which we also covered in a previous video, this battery was pulled off the summit of Lookout Mountain here and moved closer to Missionary Ridge. But you can just see the commanding view that Garrity's Alabama battery had perched high on Lookout Mountain here. And again, this view, just absolutely beautiful. And I hope you're enjoying this part of the video as well. So we're coming to another artillery position of the Confederates here that I just wanted to touch on real quick. So in this area, you had Corput's Georgia battery, and he had 4 12-pound Napoleon guns. And from this position, they hurled about 33 shells per the sign here. But just wanted to give you a view of this battery here. Now keep in mind, so you had the Battle of Wauhatchie taking place at some point here after the Cracker Line was open. And then, of course, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, you had the Union troops kind of sweeping down in front of us here. But keep in mind, once Union troops were that close, you can't really lower your muzzles to fire on them. So a lot of the firing probably took place out in here. But just wanted to give you another view of the Georgia battery at this location. Now, by 2 p.m., the famed Battle Above the Clouds was over. It was a Union victory. Braxton Bragg would pull his men off Lookout Mountain and reinforce Missionary Ridge. Grant now had his second victory here at Chattanooga.
While assaulting Lookout Mountain, Sergeant Kiggins of the 149th New York seized his regiment's U.S. flag, mounted a big tree stump, and began waving the banner back and forth to alert the Federal artillerymen they were shelling friendly forces. While doing this, a Confederate bullet grazed his head, and he was wounded in the thigh. Later, he found 9 bullet holes in his uniform. Kiggins would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions,